I want to welcome now officially Dr. O'Hanlon, who is certainly no stranger to this council. I've actually lost track of the number of times that Dr. O'Hanlon has met with us up here, and it's always been enjoyable, and it's always been informative and educational. Dr. O'Hanlon has both his bachelor's degree and master's degree from Princeton, and it's a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science degree initially. So he understands math as well as words. But then he did his PhD in International Affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton as well. So he understands words as well as math. And almost no one does it as well as he does. I think he is the author of at least 12 books, 400 or so, and I've lost count, of articles and commentaries and what have you. He is. I want to make sure I have this right. He is an adjunct professor at Columbia and Georgetown Universities, and he's a lecturer at George Washington University. And he has served as an advisor to the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. And back when, he was also a Peace Corps volunteer working in Zaire. Dr. O'Hanlon, it is our pleasure and honor to have you back.
Thank you so kindly. It's great to see everybody. It's really a treat to be up here with you all and to see community returning and to be up at the top of the World Trade Center in Baltimore, and what's one of my favorite towns in the United States, with not just one of the best councils, but just one of the best cities. So thank you for having me. And since we're all together, I think I should be relatively brief in my conversation or my presentation, so we can have a fun conversation, since we're all enjoying human presence and company for the first time in a while in a setting like this. And thank you very kindly for the wonderful introduction, including making my job a little easier by starting to explain what the book's about, because I don't want to walk through all the detailed analyses or recommendations, but what I'd like to do is maybe start by explaining the main thing I was trying to accomplish with the book and the main reason I wanted to write it. And probably some of you were a little surprised by the title, The Art of War in an Age of Peace. Like, what the devil is this guy thinking inside the Beltway in Washington? Have the people there lost their mind even more than usual? What age of peace? And what I meant by that was that, in fact, if you take a historical perspective on where we are today in interstate relations, we don't have many wars between countries. And we have almost no wars between the great powers. Now, I know your immediate reaction is, yeah, but what about President Xi in China? What about President Putin in Russia? What about, Russia grabbing Crimea? What about the Chinese, pushing a few Indian soldiers to their death in the Himalaya Mountains and threatening Taiwan? Yes, it's fraught. All of our progress is fragile. But these are not wars. Any of the problems I just mentioned, these are not great power wars. I can see a couple of you in the room are old enough, like me, to remember real wars. And of course, we've been fighting a very protracted, low to moderate intensity war, which has not been low to moderate for the people fighting it. But we've been at war for a long time. Nonetheless, when we take a real historical view, and we bear in mind how great powers usually have settled their differences historically, this has been an age of peace. There has really been no great power war since 1945. Now, I suppose we could quibble. We could say, the Chinese did intervene in the Korean War, so maybe I should say there's been no great power war since 1953. Or maybe you want to count one of the border skirmishes between the then Soviet Union and China, 1969 or something, and maybe we could say there's been no war since then. But my point is that even the Korean War is getting to be quite a while ago. The skirmishes between the Soviet Union and China were within the communist bloc as it was starting to splinter, and they don't really count as big wars. There have been a lot of small wars. There have been a lot of civil wars. There have been a lot of interventions, whether it's by France and Britain in Africa or us in the broader Middle East or other things. It's not been a particularly easy period, but since 1945, we have still sort of found a way to keep the peace. And I think it's important to keep this in mind to establish some perspective, because it's too easy to read the newspaper and listen to the politicians and policy analysts and feel like the world is on the edge of falling apart. The danger of that, apart from raising all of our blood pressure, which is bad enough, serious enough of a reason to concern me, is that we could overreact. If we think that there's something about this period in world history that is somehow akin, let's say, to the late 1930s in Europe, when Hitler was on the move and he had big ambitions, and then he took the temperature of Britain and France and others, and he realized they didn't really want to get involved in saving Austria or Poland or what have you, especially Austria. And so he started his aggressions. And some people think with that model in mind that if we let the Russians today or the Chinese today get away with even these smaller excesses, smaller ambitions, that it's just going to be the precursor of bigger stuff. Well, I share that worry. And that's why with the Senkaku paradox and with this new book, I try to talk about ways to push back and punish minor offenses so that there won't be any confusion about our willingness to do so and to resist even more serious aggression. But we should not confuse the small aggression with the big aggression. So a Senkaku paradox, a kind of crisis, could be there's 8 of these little lousy islands, with all apology. I mean, they're pretty, you know. But they're lousy. Nothing happens on them. No one lives there. The dispute between China and Japan over who should own them, you know, if you want to be sarcastic, you could say it's a dispute over what language the goats are going to speak, because there's no people on these. There aren't even field trips. There aren't even ecology sorties to these places. There's some fishing in the waters around. So there is that limited amount of territorial consequence or economic consequence to ownership. But it's really more about pride, more about the legacy and the ongoing difficulty of China and Japan and Korea moving beyond World War II, the degree to which the Chinese feel like we weren't fair in how we resolved all the territorial issues. Sure, we took Taiwan back from Japan and we, you know, kicked them out of Manchuria and a few other things, but we didn't solve this one to the Chinese liking. And so as a result, the Chinese and Japanese both claim these uninhabited islands. And we don't have an official U.S. position on whose they should be, but we're still roped in to defending them if they get attacked, because Japan technically administers them. And by the terms of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, it doesn't matter if Japan owns them. Remember, we don't have a position on that. But because Japan administers them, whatever it means to administer islands where no one lives and nothing happens, therefore we are locked in. And President Obama publicly said this, that he considered the U.S.-Japan treaty to apply to the Senkaku Islands. It might have been a good thing for him to say at the time, because you don't want the Chinese to get the idea that we are uninterested. You wouldn't want to, you know, pull another April Glaspie or Dean Acheson where they gave Saddam Hussein or Kim the idea that we wouldn't defend Kuwait or Korea. And then, lo and behold, war results. So I think Obama probably made the right kind of statement, but do we really want to fight the Chinese over that kind of an issue? So I don't want people to overreact to the problems we have today. Generally speaking, however, we do need to be good at the art of war. So it's still going to be a period where we got to keep strong defense. And nothing about this progress, you know, it's funny to talk about progress during COVID, during a time of Putin and Erdogan and Duterte and all the other problems in the world. But if you take a broad historical perspective, there have never been more people living as a percentage of the human race living in free or partly free countries. There have never been more people living a middle-class existence or better. COVID set us back a little, but in 2019, for the first time in human history, we reached a point where half of the world's population could be defined as middle class or above. And that was done with, you know, not just some random choose a number as to what it means to be middle class. It was done on a country-by-country basis by economists at Brookings and elsewhere, looking at what it took to basically have a decent roof over your head, meal on the table for you and your family, some education for your kids, some health care if you got sick, sort of what we define as a middle-class life, but, you know, adjusted for different countries' wealth and requirements. And for the first time in history, we reached 50%. So there's something that's been going right, even in the midst of all these terrible headlines. And it's easy to forget because we focus and fixate on the mistakes or the tragedies. I'm heartbroken about Afghanistan. I thought President Biden made a big mistake in pulling out. I'm sure some of you don't agree with me, but most of you probably agree it's heartbreaking to see what's happened. Frankly, I'm a little relieved it hasn't been worse, to be honest, but we can come back to this later. The point is, something like Afghanistan gets the headlines. The quiet success stories don't, right? The Bangladeshis, or the Ghanas, or the Colombia, although Colombia is always a little bit up and down, and a lot of countries are. And you tend to hear about them more when they've had a setback or when they've got a crisis. And I'm not saying life is easy in most of these places. I'm not saying everybody's living easy and happy and fun and prosperous lives, but things have been getting better over time. But all this progress is fragile. And if I'm relatively confident we can persuade Putin and Xi not to start launching big wars, it's because we're engaged as a strong America, as a strong ally of many countries overseas, and with powerful armed forces, as well as the credible willingness to use those forces, at least in defense of the things that do count. Not so much, I hope, the Senkaku Islands, but the main islands of Japan, for example. Not so much every rock in the Baltic Sea, but the Baltic countries. And those are the kind of distinctions that I would make. So it's an art of war that we need to maintain in order to keep this an age of peace and to try to solidify the peace. Because I'm sure I haven't persuaded all of you that it's an age of peace, but I will concede that even to the extent I think it's largely described correctly in those terms, it's fragile and it's far from solid. The foundations of that peace are in some ways being tested and maybe even somewhat eroded by the Xis, by the Putins. And we haven't even talked about the Iranians and North Koreans and others. Nor have we talked about the new threats. So one quick thing before I want to get into the idea of resolute restraint in just a second, and that's the main additional point I want to make. But just one point I think that's important to get on the table that I make in my book in one of the later chapters is some of you who follow the Pentagon closely will know that going back about 6 years, we've been thinking about 5 main threats. Not to say there's only 5, but going back to when General Joseph Dunford was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, at the latter couple of years of the Obama administration, through the period of Secretary Mattis and the Trump years, there's actually been a fair amount of bipartisan continuity in defense strategy making, which to me is encouraging given how ugly the high-level politics has been. But we've really seen this evolution through people like General Dunford and now General Milley, and on the civilian side through Ash Carter and Jim Mattis, Mark Esper, now Lloyd Austin. And there's a fair amount of, focus on Russia and China. But the overall framework that we've been talking about, people use different little slogans, but it's sort of 5 main threats. And the 5 are Russia and China, North Korea and Iran, and then terrorism. And people sometimes talk about it as 4+1, because the first 4 are countries, specific places on a map. The last one is more of a transnational problem, movement, so it's of a different type. Those are the threats that we've had to deal with and we still focus on at the Pentagon and in industry and elsewhere. And now we sort of talk about this more as 2+3, because starting with Mattis, we really prioritized Russia and China first, but it's still sort of the same 5. But I would argue, and do argue in the book, there's another 4+1 to worry about. And I'm not trying to be just some curly-haired liberal from Brookings when I make this pitch, because these are different kinds of transnational threats, but I am saying that they have now complicated our lives further because they have not displaced the old threats. The old threats are still there, and in some ways they could actually complicate the old threats. And the way I describe them, just to have an easy way of capturing a lot of these new forces, most of them relatively new as a result of growing populations, changing technology. The first one is biological threats, and under that hat I put pandemics, as well as biological weapons. And we'll see which one of those winds up being a bigger concern in the years to come. Historically, they've both been concerns. So there's the biological threat. Second is the nuclear proliferation threat. So as distinct from the countries that already have the bomb that are on that original 4+1 set of problems, there is the possibility of more countries getting the bomb. And because nuclear weapons remain far and away the most powerful on Earth, I think it's worth having that category. Then I have a category that I call digital threats, and that's cyber, the kind of stuff we've been dealing with for 20, 30 years, hacking and all sorts of threats to our infrastructure and the things that Russia does to us in presidential campaigns and all that. And there's also the looming concept of AI. And whether you think, we have to worry about Terminator robots anytime soon, AI means that some of the traditional cyber threats could get worse, and robotics could change in the nature of warfare and become much more difficult to address. So certainly digital threats would be a third category after biological and nuclear, and then climate threat. Again, I don't think you have to choose sides in the great climate debate. Are we headed for catastrophe or not? I don't know, but I think it's pretty factually clear that climate is complicating everything else, climate change, and that it could actually exacerbate some of the old 4+1, or, by the way, it could cause big problems separate from those 5 particular traditional threats. For example, India and Pakistan, for all their challenges they've posed to each other historically, they've been pretty good, I think it's fair to say, my friends who study India and Pakistan and know it well, pretty good at sharing water for 60 years, going back to treaties that were signed in the early 1960s. But that was contingent on there being enough water to go around, on the Himalayan glaciers still being in place, on the water tables in the main part of the Indian subcontinent not being exhausted or infiltrated by seawater. And so in the years ahead, what if global warming worsens and reduces the availability of water, which then makes it harder for India and Pakistan to compromise on the rivers, which then increases the risk of Indo-Pakistani conflict. So there are ways in which the new threats can challenge the old threats or exacerbate or intensify them. And then finally, in the second 4+1, the second set of threats I'm proposing to you, I would have to place American domestic cohesion or lack thereof. Because if we don't have the basis for a strong America in the world today, in addition to being a big problem for how we live our lives here at home and get along with each other, I don't think the world order does very well without a strong United States. And there's not really an obvious alternative. By the way, I was just, we had a Brookings retreat today. It was private, but nonetheless, Bob Kagan has said enough of the same things in public. He's one of my favorite colleagues and just a brilliant strategist and historian. And people sometimes, those of you who read Bob, sometimes people sort of mischaracterize him as a neocon, because he was relatively supportive of the war to overthrow Saddam. But a lot of times I think of neocons as people who just say the United States is great, look at our Declaration of Independence, look at our Constitution, look at our founding fathers, and look at all the things in our history. We're just special people, by golly. And what Kagan says is, we are exceptional, but I'm not sure we're any smarter than anybody else. I'm not sure we're any nicer than anybody else. I'm not sure we make better decisions than anybody else. I'm not sure most of our foreign policy is all that well implemented. But nonetheless, we've seen what the world looks like without an engaged United States, and we've seen what it looks like with an engaged United States, and the contrast could not be more stark. And it's partly because of our geography. We're sort of separate enough from other countries that we're more or less safe from traditional kinds of military threats, but the planet is small enough that we can sort of get to Eurasia if and when we put our mind to it. And everybody knows that. So this allows us to play a different kind of role than other powers play, because people say, well, let those countries solve their own problems, let those regions solve their own problems. But we know the old adage that familiarity doesn't always breed love. Familiarity can breed contempt and tension. And a more far-away power, even if it's no smarter, nicer, wiser, still may be a little bit more disengaged or able to be disengaged or dispassionate, objective in how it addresses certain problems, even if we make a lot of mistakes along the way. So I think that the new 4+1 has to include this issue of American domestic cohesion, because if we don't stay together and we don't feel like all parts of our society are benefiting from the kind of world that we've built and in which we live, then our foreign policy is going to change. We're going to pull back. Donald Trump talked about pulling back, but he didn't do it. The next time we elect somebody who talks like Donald Trump, they might just do it. So Donald Trump didn't like alliances or allies, but lo and behold, when he left office, we had just as many as when he started. Partly because he couldn't find too many people, speaking of John Bolton, he couldn't find too many people to hire who agreed with his worldview within the Republican Party. And there aren't that many within the Democratic Party either, at least not in terms of the foreign policy establishment. So you want Jim Mattis, you want somebody with that charisma and prestige, great, you can ask him to serve. But he's not going to become an isolationist just because you hired him in an administration that has isolationist tendencies. But the next time this country elects a populist president, and maybe it will be Donald Trump again, or maybe it'll be somebody else, right or left, what we have seen in the last few elections is that much of the country, especially in the middle and working classes, is especially dubious that all this international engagement is good for them. And until we can fix the society such that they have, again, regained their confidence that this kind of world order is beneficial for all Americans, they may elect someone. I say they as if it's a different group, but it's within our midst. A lot of you voted for Trump. A lot of people I know voted for Trump. I mean, people vote for him or for a Bernie Sanders or for a populist for different reasons. But the point is, we elected one 5 years ago, and we could do it again. And the next time we do it, it may be somebody who actually follows through on what he campaigns on by way of disengaging from the world. Trump did not really follow through, thank goodness, from my vantage point. He talked bad about the allies, but he didn't break any alliances. But if we did imagine a United States that pulled back, I don't know what replaces that because, one more big broad theme, and then I'm going to say a couple of words about resolute restraint and then look forward to the discussion. But a lot of you will know that in the academic world, it's not just Donald Trump, in the academic world there are a lot of scholars who say we're too engaged. And they go by different names. The old-fashioned pejorative term that people would use to disagree with such folk would be isolationist. That's not entirely fair, and it's not what most of this group in academia calls itself. They tend to use two other words to describe themselves: offshore balancers or restrainers. And they're some of the very best professors in the country. Barry Posen at MIT, Steve Walt at Harvard, John Mearsheimer at Chicago, Michael Desch at Notre Dame. There are a lot of, and some of them were my professors. They're all brilliant. I read them all. And a lot of them actually want to reduce or scale back our alliances and our role in the world. And I always want to, if any of them are watching, I always want to ask, I know you're all better political scientists than I am, but help me understand these three data points and why your theory works in light of these three data points. World War I, it broke out with no American overseas role in Eurasia to speak of, no security guarantees, no alliances, no military presence. So we have the outbreak of World War I with American disengagement. We have the outbreak of World War II with American disengagement, because we still didn't have any allies. Wilson's concept for a League of Nations didn't work. And then the non-outbreak of World War III with American permanent alliances and engagements abroad. Now, yes, a lot of other things changed in the world: nuclear weapons, spread of democracy, memories of what had happened in the world wars and how devastating they had been. But I still say you had two world wars happen when we were not engaged in Eurasia. You had no further world wars once we did engage. And that's just doesn't prove anything definitively, but it's pretty interesting historical correlation. So I want us to stay engaged. So I want to worry about these new 4+1, including that domestic cohesion piece, just as much as the overseas threats. But I still say it's an age of peace, because we've had less interstate war than really ever before in human history. We've had no great power war to speak of for decades. And we've had enough stability in the way the world functions that everybody's gotten a lot richer. Not everybody, but half the world is middle class or better. By the way, in those glorious golden days of immediately after World War II, when we were sitting on top of the world and everything seemed so great, you know how many people in the world were above the middle class threshold? 10%. So there was, for all the Vietnams and Koreas and Iraqs and Afghanistans, we've still managed to do some things right because the basic structure of the international order has allowed all that prosperity to happen and prevented World War III. So that's why, to me, it's an age of peace. But let me say also why I'm in favor of restraint. I just told you, I think, why I'm in favor of resoluteness. So, again, the subtitle of the book is U.S. Grand Strategy and Resolute Restraint. And what I mean by the resoluteness is let's stay engaged with the major allies, especially in those parts of the world that George Kennan and others told us were the most important: Western Europe, Northeastern Asia, a few other key areas. The Middle East, sort of in a different category, maybe a half notch lower in importance, but still quite important. Some of our other allies around the world, like Australia, important in their own right too. But basically, the alliances that we have in those places, as well as our commitments to keep the oceans and the atmosphere, the global commons, as Barry Posen describes, available for everyone, safe for everyone to use, safe for business, safe for travel. These are crucial elements that we have to be resolute to defend. So that part, I'm sort of sounding like a classic American. You're probably wondering why you bothered to bring me up from Washington. Anybody could have come up from Washington and said that. That's sort of standard fare. But the different part of my message, from at least a lot of colleagues, is that I think we also need to be restrained, partly because we can see that the world is pretty good, and we don't need to go out of our way with our military to make it a whole lot better. Now, what I mean by that, when people talk this way, usually they're just promising you some prescription to avoid the next Iraq war. And, who would be against avoiding the next Iraq war? But I don't know exactly how to prevent the next Iraq war, but I do think that our alliances in Europe especially, but around the world, are adequate to our interests and needs. I do not think we should further expand NATO, and I do not think we should be looking for new allies to counter China. I think we're pretty good as we are, because to me, alliances are not just clubs of like-minded countries. They are unnatural in the sense that we are, in the treaties that undergird these alliances, we are promising to send our sons and daughters to go fight and die in defense of these countries as if it were our own territory. That's not a very natural thing to do. In fact, it's sort of half crazy when you think about it, which is why Wilson couldn't get his League of Nations through Congress, and why historically great powers have not acted this way. But we have, and part of it was the fear of the Cold War. Without a Cold War, without a Soviet threat, we probably never would have created most of these alliances. And now the Soviet threat's gone, but the logic for having roughly 2/3 of the world's economic power organized cohesively in one collective is still pretty powerful. Because what it means is that if you're a China or a Russia, and you're trying to increase your own visibility and influence, do you really think you can take on the West? Well, maybe you can divide them a little. Maybe you can help Trump get elected. Maybe you can try to get Le Pen elected in France. Maybe you can try to splinter NATO from within. But you know what? Turns out at the end of the day, through all that, these allies and alliances held together pretty well, and we still have 2/3 of all world economic power within one group of nations. It's not like they all do what we tell them to do. In fact, that's part of why this whole thing survives, is because if they don't agree with us, they sit out that war, whatever war it might be. But the fact that we have 2/3 of world economic and military power, at least loosely organized within this Western coalition, is a big part of the reason why no one's going to really, in my judgment, want to take us on. Because we already represent not only military potential and power, but the consumer markets these countries need to have any kind of success economically. So I very much like that basic situation. I think we're using alliances in the right way to protect territories that are crucial to keeping that favorable overall balance of power. But I don't want to use the alliances to promise that we're going to send Americans thousands of miles away, especially when right up to the doorstep of Russia or China, and places they probably care about more than we do and know better than we do. So you probably recall that an official policy of NATO is to someday bring Ukraine and Georgia into the alliance. With apologies to Ukrainians and Georgians who may be in the room, people of Ukrainian and Georgian descent, I know a bunch. I don't think we should do that. And in fact, I don't even think we've been helping them with that promise, because we made that promise 13 years ago, President Bush at the Bucharest summit in 2008, but we gave no timetable for when they would be invited in and no interim security guarantee. So they got giant bullseyes painted on their back. And so our whole policy has been counterproductive. It's actually helped encourage Putin's support for aggression against them, because as long as their security is destabilized, they're not eligible for NATO membership. So Putin puts two and two together. It's like, these countries want to come into NATO, NATO wants to bring them in. How can I prevent that? Create some little wars along their border. I'm not blaming us morally, but I am questioning our strategic good judgment. And I think we need to look for a different way, not just to sell these countries down the river, but to look for a new architecture that Putin would have to do his part to support, that would basically say, let's create a zone of neutrality. And it's only going to work if Russia pulls its forces out of eastern Ukraine, stops the aggression there, lets these countries live in peace. We don't necessarily need to get Crimea back for the Ukrainians, I don't think, but we need to prevent Russia from destabilizing the country in general. And so, if and when we can get Putin to agree to that, then we can lift the economic sanctions, or at least most of the economic sanctions we've imposed on Russia, and this can become a more stable Europe and reinforce the foundations of the age of peace. Because as much as I believe it's an age of peace, every so often Putin makes me nervous that it may not stay that way. And certainly in 2014, 15, 16, he was making me quite nervous. So that's one example. Let me just give two more examples of restraint, and then I'll stop. One has to do with the Senkaku Islands, and building, Robbie, on your kind earlier points, that if we wake up one day and the Chinese have come ashore on one Senkaku Island, they're not just going to do it and pound their chest and say, we took this from Japan. They're going to take a page out of their buddy Vladimir Putin's playbook and come up with some excuse that everybody knows is a lie, but they're going to say it with a straight face, and they're going to say it often enough that some people will believe them. They're going to be like, oh, we had a shipwreck, and our boat's broken, or there was some fisherman whose boat broke, and we came out to save him, and then there was a storm, and we ran aground, and so don't worry, we're not going to stay here that long. As soon as we can work out a few little details with Japan about proper sharing of the islands, we'll be happy to go back home. They're going to use some kind of a duplicitous rationale. And then what are we going to do? Well, the Japanese would hope that our position would be, we'll fight to take them back. I think that might be the right thing to say before the crisis, but that it would be crazy to do if you get to that point. You shouldn't have war with a nuclear-armed adversary over uninhabited rocks. What you should do is make it clear to the Chinese, we have a lot of ways to push back proportionately. And this is where, while I'm not a fan of President Trump overall, I will give him a little bit of credit. Some of his strategies for economic pressure and warfare against China could be adopted and adapted to address this kind of a situation, where we talk about decoupling from China and having a little less dependency on them for certain things. And we probably do need some more resilience against Chinese economic warfare ourselves, but we're not really decoupling categorically right now, and I don't think we need to. But we should be willing and able to decouple if and when they do the kinds of things at the Senkaku Islands that I'm worried about. So we need a more integrated way of thinking about response strategies that doesn't require shooting first and drawing first blood in a superpower confrontation over the kinds of limited disputes that are most at the center of our problems with China today. Admittedly, the Taiwan problem is not just a little piece of rock. It's 23 million people. That one's harder, and that may be the single greatest danger in the world today, is the future of Taiwan and what China wants to do about it. But I think that rather than, and Bridge Colby will talk about this is a very good book. We're going to have him at Brookings too, and I just read it last week. And he addresses a lot of important problems, not least that if we try to fight China near and over Taiwan, we might lose, even today. Now, when I say lose, might lose a tactical engagement, then you have to decide, are you going to escalate? Are you going to start attacking the Chinese homeland? Are you going to consider nuclear threats? These are the questions that could raise themselves. And I don't really want to get into those kinds of questions too quickly. So even for a Taiwan contingency, I would like to have other kinds of options. Let's say if the Chinese blockade Taiwan, I think we need options to counter-blockade China and do that primarily as an economic warfare strategy together with allies who represent collectively 2/3 of world GDP, and maybe use our military in the Indian Ocean to reinforce the blockade there, further away from China where our advantages are stronger. Again, you don't have to rule out direct defense of Taiwan. The problem is it's not 100% clear we can do it right now. And especially what I call a leaky blockade. China uses submarines to sink a few ships coming in and out of Taiwan. Then they back off. If they see us coming, they wait and retract their forces. And then once we're gone, they go back and do it again. They can really drag the Taiwan economy down pretty badly. We need some better answers to that. But they should be answers that are resolute but also restrained, because we don't want to wind up on a path to nuclear war over the kinds of issues that divide us from China. Very last thing, last example, and I'll stop, is North Korea. And by the way, you're very kind to have me today. You probably are wishing that if you were going to have a Brookings colleague this week, that it would have been Fiona Hill. I'm sure a lot of you are seeing her all over and by the way, it's not just Fiona. Bruce Jones and Bruce Rydell have written fantastic books in the last 2 weeks. Bruce Rydell's is about the U.S.-Jordan relationship over the years, and it's sensational. And Bruce Jones wrote about global maritime competition. And so really recommend that. Fiona, of course, it's an amazing book. I would strongly recommend that you read her book. But she managed to do enough interviews this week to draw a response from the 45th president. Not sure if you saw that. But she was lumped in with John Bolton by Donald Trump as, a bad person and a bad intellect. And I don't think of Fiona Hill and John Bolton as being very similar, even though I think they did have a good working relationship, and I've heard Fiona express respect for Ambassador Bolton, and I have respect for him as well, even though I often wind up disagreeing. But the point is on this, that Donald Trump did say one thing in this communique today, trashing Fiona, that I half agreed with, not about Fiona, but about North Korea. And what he said was that Bolton prevented him from really continuing the diplomacy with Kim Jong-un because Bolton wanted to use the so-called Libya model, meaning, if Libya model means different things to different people, to Kim Jong-un it probably means getting killed the same way Gaddafi got killed by, and Bolton didn't really mean that, but he did mean complete disarmament all in one fell swoop. And I hope if some of you are here when the ambassador comes, you'll press him on why he thinks that's realistic. I don't think the North Koreans are ever going to agree to give up all their bombs at once. I think we need a two-step process at a minimum. And the first step, in my judgment, and this is where the restraint comes in, where the sort of realism comes in, should be to ask them to stop making more bombs. And when I say ask, I don't really mean ask, I mean verifiably agree to stop making more bombs. Because factories that make nuclear weapons are pretty big. And we know where at least most of them are in North Korea. And so we can probably do a pretty good job of verifying an end to the expansion of North Korea's nuclear arsenal, as well as a permanent ban on nuclear testing and ICBM, long-range missile testing. And if the North Koreans will agree to that, I think we should agree to a partial lifting of the sanctions that we've imposed on them collectively over the years, especially after their 2017 nuclear and missile tests. And so, in fact, I would favor lifting the UN sanctions and keeping the US sanctions. So we still have some leverage for the longer term to get rid of the bombs they already have, but we do this more practical trade. I think it's where Trump and Kim Jong-un were sort of headed after the Hanoi summit in early 2019, and then they met again at the DMZ later that spring. But meanwhile, John Bolton and others were saying to President Trump, you got to get complete denuclearization or it's not worth it. On that point, I disagree with Ambassador Bolton, and I sort of agree with Trump's instincts. The problem is Trump himself didn't stay disciplined enough to stay at the job, so the whole thing sort of fell apart. But those are examples of where I would show restraint, not expanding alliances further, being very careful about war plans that are escalatory in the first instance, and being more pragmatic about nuclear negotiations with countries like North Korea. So I've gone on a little too long already. I'll stop there, but look forward very much to your reactions and questions. Thank you.
What is the role of the UN?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know that the UN has prevented great power war, because if the great powers really want to disagree with each other, they all have vetoes at the UN Security Council, and so the UN Security Council can't even really pass a resolution without their agreement, and certainly can't mobilize military power. However, for a lot of other problems, the UN's been great. Two big categories of problems. One is, I just mentioned with North Korea, applying sanctions against countries whose behavior is so egregious that even a Vladimir Putin and a Xi Jinping agree that there need to be consequences. And we collectively applied that pressure against Iran. Probably if we did a show of hands, half the people in this room would support the Iran nuclear deal with President Obama and half would not. But the fact that it was even possible to discuss it was largely because of UN and US sanctions. Same thing with North Korea, as I was just discussing. So that category of applying largely economic power to set the conditions whereby a country is hopefully deterred from misbehaving, and even if they aren't deterred, they're weakened over time, that's been a big contribution. Second, as my good friend Lise Howard, a Georgetown professor who studies UN peacekeeping, she points out, and other scholars have done this as well, UN peacekeeping is a really good bargain for the money. What I mean by that is not that it solves every problem, but neither do we. We go spend $1 trillion or more in Iraq or Afghanistan, and we don't necessarily solve the problem. The UN spends $7 billion a year, $7 billion, on 12 to 14 peacekeeping missions around the world. And depending on how you measure the historical cases, 50 to 60% of these missions wind up at least partially successful. So if you're in any one country, that may not be reassuring because you may not be one of the 50 to 60%. But if you look across Africa and the Middle East, South Asia, there have been a lot of success stories on the cheap and with very few American troops involved or necessary. So those would be two categories where I think the UN has been particularly helpful. From Mark Solomons, how do we decide how big the U.S. military should be? What scenarios do we? Well, let me first paraphrase the shortest, cleanest answer that I ever heard to that question myself, and it was from a guy named General David Goldfein, who was the former Air Force Chief of Staff. And I asked him that question after a lot of this great power competition stuff was getting in the air. This was around 2019. And he said, be able to defeat Russia or China in conventional war while protecting the homeland, while also keeping our nuclear deterrent intact and ready to go so that if Russia or China wanted to escalate, they would know they couldn't succeed on that front, while also maintaining deterrence of North Korea, while also maintaining momentum in the war on terror. So he said Russia or China. He didn't say both together. That's a whole separate interesting question. And then he didn't say Iran and North Korea at the same time. He wanted to be able to keep deterring them while we're fighting Russia. So he's making assumptions that we're not going to have multiple simultaneous wars. And those assumptions may or may not be correct, and you think about that a lot in your work too, I know. But that's sort of been the construct. So we do imagine doing ongoing operations in the broader Middle East, maintaining forward presence and deterrence in places like Korea, and then simultaneously being able to win one big one. That's essentially the four-sizing construct. Now, the interesting thing is it actually winds up producing a military that is not that different in size from the one that we built to handle Iraq and North Korea, so we thought, back in the 1990s and the 2000s. So you could say that there's not an obvious super strong link between the strategy and the resulting forces that we actually maintain. And of course, that's a running debate as well. And how much does the force structure matter versus what you give those forces to fight with, the weaponry, the technology? But I could go on to answer the question, defeat Russia or China, deter North Korea and Iran, protect the homeland, maintain nuclear deterrence, and maintain momentum in the war on terror. That's the best answer I've heard to that question. Yeah, and whether what China just did in Hong Kong has any parallels with what Hitler did with Austria and with Czechoslovakia. I should acknowledge that there are some. That's probably why you asked the question. You were perhaps thinking that way yourself. In both cases, a large government claimed jurisdiction over a different piece of land based on history and based on who lived there and common language and common, ethnicity. In the case of Hong Kong, let's also, however, be fair that it was the British who took it away from the Chinese in the first place. And I don't like what's happened in Hong Kong, but the Chinese went through 100 years of getting the heck beaten out of them. The Germans had no such excuse. The Germans were the primary, in my opinion, and I'm German-American by part of my background, but the Germans were the primary aggressor in World War I, got a bad peace deal out of that, admittedly, but had no excuse for what they did in World War II. And in most of the wars before World War I, they were winning most of the time. The Chinese got carved up by Europe in the century prior to the Communist Party taking power. And I'm not defending them. It's heartbreaking to see what's happened to Hong Kong, but it's also not mass murder. To me, it is the Chinese reclaiming what they consider their own territory, and I do think we should punish them, but it's a case where I want to be resolute but restrained. So it's not worth a war. And in fact, the Chinese, as much as they're setting Hong Kong back in many ways, again, they've been, by the standards of history, by the standards of human beings, they've been fairly restrained in terms of their use of physical violence. Notice how I started that sentence. I'm not saying it's been justifiable or appropriate, but it's been modest compared to what the Adolf Hitlers of the world did, certainly. So ultimately, I do see some echoes, but I'd say mostly the cases are different. And in any case, I only try to go so far in making an exact analogy. To me, the bigger question is, what do we do now about Hong Kong, regardless of whether it smacks of Hitler or not? And I do think that the Chinese need to know that when they do things to their own people or to individuals they consider their own people, that we're watching and we will respond in various ways. And some of that could involve making our defense strategy even more focused on Taiwan, because the Chinese are sort of giving away their hand, that they're even more intent on reunifying what they see as their rightful. By the way, you got to tell Bridge how much of his advertising I was doing for him when he comes up. But it's supposed to be my book we're talking about tonight, not his. But you know, we are pushing back. We have imposed a lot of sanctions on China. We have focused more of our military planning on China. We have worked more with China's neighbors to tighten cooperation on preparing for economic warfare as well as military campaigns, Australia, Japan, India, and others. And so I think this is the way we have to proceed, with step-by-step proportionate responses. And so that's what I would do in regard to Hong Kong. And the other good news is, in the 1930s, the United States was just sitting out European security. We were not interested, we were not engaged. We're not sitting out anything in Eurasia these days. We're pretty engaged, and we've got a lot of allies very close by, and the Chinese know it. Should we feel threatened by the Belt and Road Initiative, which is, of course, China's big infrastructure plan, largely around Eurasia, but even extending beyond to build up infrastructure in a lot of other countries? For the most part, no, but it depends. There are places in Africa and poorer countries where China's gone in and they've signed bad deals. They've thrown some money under the table to a corrupt government to get them to sign the deal. It has too high of a price tag for what that country can afford, and then they have very severe stipulations in the agreement that if the country defaults on its loan repayments, then China gains equity or ownership of the infrastructure that it's just built. That's bad news. That's corrupt, and it's severely injurious to the countries at issue when China does that, and they do some of that. However, when they work with, let's say, an Indonesia or a Bangladesh, middle-income countries, sometimes those countries really want the infrastructure. And some of those countries have enough capacity in their planning and in their governments to actually make sure that the deals look pretty good. And by the way, they don't always have alternative sources of financing, because sometimes we in the democracies haven't done enough to make that financing possible. Luckily, the Japanese are pretty active in Southeast Asia, for example, and we're trying to get more active with the BUILD Act and a few other things that combine public and private money now to create alternatives. But we have to avoid demonizing the Belt and Road Initiative, because there are a lot of countries that actually want it. And China's providing a service to some of them, not all of them. And Pakistan, Malaysia, they've pushed back against some of the more expensive concepts, and they should. And we should help them evaluate these proposals and maybe have alternatives, or at least know how to judge whether a given offer from China is really desirable for their interest. But we have to avoid painting BRI all in one shade of color, because there are times where it's achieving some good things, other times where it's exploitative. Yeah, it's a great question. It's about economic resilience. So I'm talking about economic warfare as a preferred strategy to handle small to medium-sized Chinese aggression. But that raises the obvious question, would we survive that warfare if China retaliates? Especially because they produce most of the world's rare earth metals. You know, they produce a lot of consumer goods. They produce a lot of electronics. And so I think absolutely we need a more resilient American economy. There has been progress on this, yes. For example, President Trump and now President Biden have been using the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, partly in the whole 5G brouhaha, but in other areas as well, to try to limit where China has access to American or other countries' sort of high-end infrastructure, partly because we're worried they could sabotage it in the event of a crisis if they've sort of been able to plant bugs. Also, they could use those kinds of technologies on our territories for listening, for espionage of their own, and partly because we just don't want to get to the point where our economies are so dependent on China that the minute, China threatens a little bit of retaliation, we all back down. So, and I think that I'm just in a way just restating your question, not really answering it very well, but the use of CFIUS to make sure that the Chinese have a hard time gaining ownership of our high-end technology sectors is one big piece. Trying to develop alternative sources of rare earth metals, which are so important for batteries and many other key areas of technology. The Chinese have not cared about protecting their environment. Getting rare earth metals out of the soil tends to be bad for the environment, so the world's developed a dependency on China. And we're going to have to figure out places in, the mountainous United States or Canada or Australia or other places where we can take out these rare earth metals from our own territory. Otherwise, we could really be in bad shape. On that one, there's an awareness of the problem. The pace at which it's getting solved looks pretty slow to me. So I'm not sure that buys us much protection in the 2020s. Anyway, I could go on, but I won't because A, I'm not the best expert on this. I have the same curiosity and concern that you do, and I've tried to do some research on this, and there's some stuff in the Senkaku paradox about it, but I think we need to speed up our strategies for improving our own economic resilience against Chinese economic warfare that might be directed against us. And our allies need it even more in many cases. So yes, it's happening, but not nearly fast enough. Going back to my Peace Corps days, DRC.
What should our role be in Africa?
Well, the good news is that Africa's making some progress, although it's a tragedy to see that Ethiopia, which was one of the poster children for great success, is now mired in a terrible internal fight. But Africa's in much better shape than it was when I was a Peace Corps volunteer there. Maybe 1/3 of the countries have some degree of political openness and some degree of economic progress. That's still not enough, but it's a lot more than the 1 or 2 or 3 back in the day. So I think generally speaking, facilitating that, a lot of it's going to be through the private sector and through our allies, France and Britain, and their historical ties to Africa, Portugal and others as well. So together we can help. I think right now in the short term, it would be a shame to have this discussion and not talk very much about COVID. To me, the one thing I would really ask the Biden administration to do is to stop sort of dribbling out these promises for 200 million more doses we're going to give away here and then 300 million more there. We need a comprehensive plan to get the entire planet vaccinated, and that plan should already exist. I know we can't vaccinate everyone this year, but the plan should already exist, fully financed, with a division of labor among the different manufacturers of vaccine and serious work on the distribution strategy. And I'm a little frustrated that we seem to be trying to get good headlines for sort of giving a few 100 million doses or promises thereof bit by bit. And I think that would be the number one thing that we could do to help Africa with its acute crisis right now that we really haven't done adequately. There was one bit of good news in the paper today that you might have seen that apparently the malaria vaccine, which is not a very good vaccine, but it's better than nothing, is now being approved. It's actually 4 shots. It only gives 30% protection, but you combine that with other measures, and it's going to, so that kind of science can help a lot as well. Well, so what I've talked about things that are not worth fighting for, but what is worth fighting for? I certainly think what we did in the world wars was correct. We fought against genocide. We fought against a collection of power in the hands of 1 or 2 hostile entities that could have ultimately threatened our own country if allowed to expand further. So you have to think about, severe and extreme human rights violations, potential threats to the American homeland over time that could result if much of Eurasia were ever organized in a hostile bloc against us. I I would say that, the Bush administration did not do a great job with the Iraq War, but being concerned about Saddam Hussein having nuclear weapons was not a crazy concern to have. They exaggerated it for political effect, but certainly weapons of mass destruction, and especially nukes, in the hands of extremist leaders. There are times where I would consider using force to prevent that. There are other times where it may make the problem worse, as it may have in Iraq. And now it's too late to do that in North Korea because we don't know where their weapons are. So, but in 2003, there might have been a case not to attack Iraq, but to attack North Korea, because that was when their nuclear capability was really small and we pretty much knew where it was. So that might be another example. And I think, one last thing, sort of a philosophical point, that even on Afghanistan, because we haven't talked about that tonight, and I know you may with General Votel, who's also, he's an excellent military leader, and I really hope he comes up here to spend time with you. On Afghanistan, I'm brokenhearted about what's happened, but I wrote a piece about this the other day. I feel like we have to give ourselves a little bit of a break. We should look for lessons, and we made a lot of mistakes. But after 9/11, we had to do something to protect ourselves, to make sure the next attack didn't happen again, maybe even with weapons of mass destruction. So we overthrew the Taliban in a mission that started 20 years ago today. And it was a very good operation for the most part. We let bin Laden get away. That was a mistake. And that was probably an avoidable mistake. But it would have been hard to capture him or kill him where he was. But we drove the Taliban from power. And then we saw, Afghanistan, faraway place, hard to fix, so we didn't do that much for the next 5 or 6 years. And we were focused on Iraq. Then we came in and said, Afghanistan's falling apart again. We better try to hurry a big fix really fast. And President Obama was left with a bad set of choices himself. That didn't work so well. So then we tried to scale it down to a lower expectation, more manageable operation with a lot fewer troops, starting with the latter Obama years through Trump. And I actually thought that was the right strategy that President Biden should have stuck with, because I actually thought that war was worth fighting. Now, again, a lot of mistakes along the way, but we had to protect ourselves. And then I think we owed some help to the Afghan people, who, after all, had helped us win the Cold War by driving the Soviets out in the 1980s. And not just driving them out, but convincing the Soviets they needed a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, and then leading to the end of the Cold War, partly because the Afghanistan mission so tired them and exhausted them. So I thought we had a certain obligation to try to help the Afghans. So even on that one, I would say, even though it's now being widely condemned as a failed mission, I'm a little more philosophical. And also a little more hopeful that the Taliban know not to mess with us again, and we can at least prevent the worst of their barbarities and of their potential associations with al-Qaeda in the future, because they saw us fight hard for 20 years to defend ourselves and our interests and our friends. And even if we decided after 20 years to leave, if we needed to go back and punish them for what they had done to hurt us or to hurt their fellow Afghans, we could do it. So that would be part of my list. Worthy of a much longer conversation, as well as your inputs, sir, I realize. So it's too bad we're about out of time, but thank you for the great question.
And speaking of thank yous, Dr. Howland, the council thanks you. I'm reminded of the words that Frank Burr used to describe your sessions with us. Frank says, Michael O'Hanlon's sessions are always educational and enjoyable. Now, that's a nice combination. Almost every speaker we have provides, it's insightful and it's educational. This one tonight is another great example of a Michael O'Hanlon at his best. It was educational and it was enjoyable. Sir, thank you very, very much.
Thank you all.
One more word. The plug for Michael O'Hanlon's book. If you are like myself and you are a chapter by chapter person, you will finish this book because it's an easy read and you can't leave it behind. Sir, thank you very much.
Take that. Thank you.